So I got 11:30 on my phone.
Of complaining.
31. No worries. The Monday, it's a day to complain. Yeah. But we will also be spared from all of that because we'll have a wonderful talk for us here in just a moment. So thanks everybody for making it. We're recording now, so it's all good. So this is the last installment of the Pro Seminar series for the spring segment. Obviously, we will be back in full force next fall. So thank you all for coming. Just want to say a couple of things to open it up and introduce our speaker. So between the fall and the spring of this year, we've really run the gamut in terms of speakers and topics, everything from food sovereignty to the enigmatic Homo naledi to user experience research to the ramifications of race science in the 19th century and whatnot. And today we continue to jump around to different topics that occupy the social sciences with our guest speaker here today, Dr. Dan Kabella, who is coming to us from the University of California, San Francisco, where they are a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. There's a whole bunch of other titles along with that, but I'm editing them down for my ease. As I suspect we'll probably hear more today, Dr. Kabella's research interests lie at the intersections of medical anthropology, social studies of science, technology, and biomedicine in the US-Mexico borderlands. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Kabella when we were both graduate students at the University of New Mexico, like over a decade ago. And actually, I think at the time you were just like a very precocious, industrious undergraduate who was taking split level graduate courses at the time. And I was still very new to the New Mexico area. I didn't really know much about Albuquerque or New Mexico in general. You were one of the first people that I met who was a social scientist studying New Mexico, who was from New Mexico, like born and raised. And I don't know if you remember this, but one of the first conversations that we had, because I didn't know anything about New Mexico. So I just said, what do you think of Breaking Bad?
Yeah.
Which I had not seen. Still had not seen Breaking Bad. The response, I think, really encapsulated your approach, was as a person, but also as a scholar. You said very gently, well, I suppose the downside of the show is that it makes people think that Albuquerque is nothing but methamphetamine, when in fact, heroin is also popular here. It's sort of critical, but sort of glass half full, open to conversations. I think very reflective of you as a person and your scholarship. After completing their MA in anthropology at UNM, they moved on to greener pastures at the Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology program as part of that much larger title at Arizona State University. So not like literal greener pastures, because ASU is so like sun-bleached concrete air conditioning units. Nevertheless, in 2023, Dr. Kabella completed their PhD at ASU with their dissertation titled Recovering Futures, Mapping the Socio-Technical Landscapes of Drug Recovery and Science in New Mexico. And despite being relatively fresh off the dissertation and starting the postdoc at UCSF, Dr. Kabella has been actively publishing for several years now with articles in peer-reviewed journals such as Alcoholism, Clinical and Research and Experimental Research, as well as a chapter titled Technologies of Repair, Naloxone, Opioid Overdose Prevention, and the Social Fabric in the 2024 edited volume. And it's the most to-the-point edited volume I've seen in a while. Medical Technology and the Social, How Medical Technology is Impacting Social Relations, Institutions, and Beliefs About What is Normal. Probably, yeah, definitely one of the more to-the-points. There might be others, but that was a pretty good one. That doesn't even begin to tap the number of talks, presentations, as well as online magazines and blogs that make up another sizable chunk of their CV. I will also plug their 2023 episode, interviewed for the episode of the much beloved anthro-themed podcast, The Dirt. That title of that episode very provocatively as big as just drug ethnographies. So there you go. When I was given the opportunity to organize this sort of fall and spring segment of the Pro Seminar series, Dr. Kabella was high on my list, somebody that I wanted to get here. Definitely wanted to strike while the iron is hot before they become too famous in the world of academia and they can no longer return my emails because it would tarnish their sterling reputation. So struck while the iron is hot with the right mix of reverence and a little bit of guilt. Just mixed right in there. And it seems to have worked as they are here with us today. The talk today is titled, as you can see, Ecologies. Oh, it's a slight title change. Ecologies of Drug Recovery. That's perfect. I like this one better. Toward an alternative border infrastructure in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Kabella.
Wow, thank you, Nick. A generous introduction. It's such an honor to be here with you, your colleagues, students. And when I got the invitation, and as I started preparing for this talk, I realized how closely we both stayed to our research topics. inspired us to take on the PhD in the first place. And for me, that was something I couldn't do alone. There was a mutual inspiration, mutual encouragement, as well as mutual aid. That made the process that much more manageable. That to say, well, I admire you as a colleague. I'd also like to take this as an opportunity to share with students how important it is to carry out the cooperative type of academic work that praises the impact of our knowledge, where we can invite our old colleagues to the future department campuses that we did. Anyways, thank you, Nick, and thank you all for being here. I know this time of the semester, we've got so much going on, and it can be difficult to be present. So thank you here in the room, and thank you online. And with that, this is a talk from the dissertation turning into a book project. Recovery Futures, which is an ethnographic study of how curanderas, physicians, scientists, people who use drugs, advocates, participate in emergent forms of addiction science, recovery medicine, and care. The book explores 3 well-meaning public health interventions for substance use disorders across historically situated contexts in New Mexico, concerned with culturally sensitive pharmaceutical treatment and models for substance use that decenter the hegemony of a strictly biological frame of drug harms. My findings suggest that treatment and prevention technologies emerge as core troubled sites of innovation that present challenges to doing medicine and science in post-colonial contexts. So in this talk, I'll present a case study from that project showing how activists build an alternative border infrastructure. I argue that despite the rise of drug war and carceral imaginaries of both Chicanos, which is the political identity they're organizing under at this time, and drugs, they offered an alternative vision for healing and community. And here I joined projects focusing on the borderlands, such as those undertaken by Gloria Anzaldúa and the many scholars that have come after her to conceptualize the border as multiple, hybrid, mutable. Inspired by critical drug studies scholars, I recognize the emancipatory potential of pharmaceutical technologies and will focus this talk on a situated account of methadone in the US-Mexico borderlands. So I'll turn now to a narrative that captures some of these connections derived from my notes from both the field and the archive. I capture my commute to a schoolhouse, which serves as a meeting place in 1967 for residents to exchange experiences about drug-related harms. These meetings were contentious. Just holding them involved members to constantly work under constraints and the proliferation of stigma that comes with addiction, while simultaneously mitigating these constraints and keeping the space free from outside interferences with police. Despite the presence of undercover agents and overall intimidation, they held them consistently every week in a part of what is known as the South Valley that I try to illuminate here in my drive. I felt the roar of the train where the quadrant of the north is separated from the south by tracks only 2 blocks from Maria's 2-bedroom family home. Driving along the Caminos, I departed the neighborhood dubbed the Brick, after the industrial brick-making company Kinney Brick. My car moved me through mixed landscapes of arid shrublands and cottonwoods that hug the river bottoms at the west bank of the Rio Grande. I passed a historical marker for El Camino Real, a road with a window to the past connecting the isolated frontier provinces of New Mexico to a colonial empire once governed by Spain and then by Mexico. I arrived at the old Armijo schoolhouse where in spring 1967, weekly meetings took place attracting residents from Atrisco's barrios. As attendance grew, the platform for those gathered turned into a forum for residents to exchange their experiences with drug use, run-ins with authorities, and vigilante violence. Like, for example, the corrupt legal process that indicted families to criminal attorneys to fight charges of drug dispossession in a biased court system, and the excessive use of force by district attorneys' henchmen, tightening their grip on drugs across borders. These struggles informed a broader understanding of their oppression, a pedagogy that was incorporated into a model for recovery that involved a pharmaceutical that would attend to the actual conditions of their use, and that all at once would keep them safe from overdose, bring stability to their use, keep them largely housed and free from incarceration. One participant in the Wednesday night meetings recalled, quote, "Here were the addicts, their families, their parents, people from respectable families too, coming to see if there was going to be a miracle," end quote. Old Armijo was a departure point for conveners to incorporate themselves under the name Kabella, which is made up of people who use drugs, recovering from drugs, and advocates. The landmark schoolhouse was familiar to residents in the area, like one of the founding members, Joe Fernandez, who spent his childhood in the Armijo neighborhood. Joe was a first-generation Mexican-American who received medic training in the military and fought in World War II before returning home to college on a GI Bill. At home in Albuquerque, he was active in the Armijo community, working as a high school math teacher, community organizer, and president of the neighborhood association. Lorenzo, a former student, remembers Joe and the school walkouts he organized protesting discrimination he and fellow Chicano teachers faced. Being a target of police violence and the subsequent imprisonment of his brother Frank based on false allegations, the Fernandez brothers knew firsthand how incarceration exacerbated drug dependence and related harms. At this time, the struggle for harm reduction was not a top priority. To fill the gap, they foregrounded concerns around drug use while also receiving movement support from leadership in the Black Berets. This collective action put pressure on the state to provide a mechanism to reduce drug harms. Joe fought to have it under a health justice sector that was grounded in the leadership of Gibran and worked in step with the Chicano movement to win power away from the criminal justice sector. It wasn't an easy undertaking because their proximity to the so-called narco frontier subjected them to drug raids, which made them prisoners to a carceral system that consumed their lands to settle legal fees and restitution debts, and in many cases perpetuated the negative consequences of illicit drug use, like overdose and drug dependence. Border engagements with drugs often involve the analysis of the border as merely a passage port where drugs flow through, and that the work of the border is done only by state agents at the borderline. Peering behind this spectacle, I see featureless landscapes like a land grant and their displaced institutions at sites where the border is refracted through it. This chapter's case study attempts to engage the border in this direction. Drug maintenance programs on the border have roots on both sides of the border, like state-run morphine clinics of the 1940s Mexico and the US methadone clinics established in the 1960s. The basis of these maintenance programs address the physiological symptoms of withdrawal and starved off cravings. In Mexico, morphine clinics were short-lived. Led by a Mexican psychiatrist, the Mexican government instituted a monopoly on morphine to bring market prices down and compete with drug traffickers. Salazar's federal regulations established addiction as a product of socioeconomic inequality to be solved through market intervention. Drug users were victimized by capitalism under a political economy of prohibition that drove prices up. Here, traffickers could exploit people by inflating drug costs. In this line of thinking, property crime was an outcome of a rational response to inequality rather than the drug user's dispossession to it. The solution, according to Salazar, was to abolish property rights and redistribute wealth. Rather than incarcerating and pathologizing drug-using communities, the state would focus solutions to undercut traffickers' earnings by offering morphine in controlled doses at low cost. In his view, carceral and strictly clinical policies miss deeper structural issues. Due to a series of internal diplomatic failures and US drug control imperialism, Mexico was forced to abandon the plan just a few weeks after it was implemented. North of the border in the US, a similar policy intervention experimented with methadone clinics that were established in 1966 for the purpose of treating addiction, both as a medical problem and as a solution to reduce crime. However, the Dole-Nystander model for treatment drew on a behavioral framework rather than a lens of economic inequality as Salazar's, proposing that people prescribed a controlled dose at a clinic could be rehabilitated. At this time, methadone came in a liquid dose and was dispensed in cups in established clinics. For Albuquerque, the distribution looped methadone back to a life with drugs in a place that disappeared people into lengthy prison sentences and their land to the court to resolve these legal debts. Recognizing the potential for opioid maintenance as a tool that could be used to conquer this destruction and build towards a future of dignity and liberation, Quebrad set a vision for how methadone can support that future in New Mexico through an ecology of drug recovery that would sustain its efforts over the long term. Making this place-based project visible is a core aim of this chapter. And in order to do that, we must rethink the border. It was a border encounter with methadone that opened possibilities for Quebrad to engage with drug-related harms on new ground and begins materially with the land. Atrisco, the land of Atrisco, was born out of the creation of Spanish settlements in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Spanish Empire gave prosperous lands of the Salado Pueblo and other Tiwa people of Spanish settlers. Under Spanish and Mexican rule, these settlements functioned as frontier posts. With the conquest of the US, collective grazing rights were transferred into individual property rights. And heirs of the grant fought each other over control over the land. By the 1960s, land declined in both subsistence and commercial use. Eventually, interfighting between descendants of the Atrisco grant ended with a conversion of communal lands into stocks under an outside management firm that converted property rights into shares. Under this regime, the firm sold much of the original land grant to real estate developers to expand the city's west side. In this context, and with surmounting pressure put on the state by activists to reconsider land grants promised in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Quebrad sought to reestablish authority over an institution that sat in between the boundaries of treaty lands. For Quebrad, the value driving this struggle was that land use was for community and the welfare of people rather than for profit. For example, in a petition that won them the land, the uses of the land, members from Quebrad wrote, the installation and the land around it makes a radar site ideal for use by Quebrad as a residential treatment center for drug addicts. There is no other use, either present or contemplative, which can serve the needs of the people of Albuquerque, as can the Quebrad program. The West Mesa radar site would become a strong weapon in the war against poverty and crime in New Mexico. So to restore a communal use of land, they worked together to repair buildings and acres of land around it, demilitarizing it from the inside out, turning housing units once inhabited by servicemen into homes for people experiencing drug-related harm. By August 1970, under the shadows of the US government's profitable nuclear industry, and in the ruins of an abandoned Cold War radar site, Quebrad transformed 54 buildings, including 27 units of residential housing and 39 acres of land, into a residential recovery treatment site. Quebrad acquired land in the buildings from the Department of Defense through funding through the War on Poverty and cash to run it. The former site had been abandoned for 3 years, leaving the first cohort of residents, staff, and community members to renovate the facilities. Joaquin Lujan, a retired community organizer and former Black Beret, remembers, quote, we went up to the radar site to help the various folks that were in the program living up there. It was pretty. We helped with the yards, isolated them from the streets, and another moment to heal. Quebrad hired Paul Garcia, an ex-addict from the barrio, to manage the residential center they refer to as the colony. Operations began at the colony on September 14th, 1970, with the first group of 14 admitted to Quebrada, who were carefully selected and given time to establish themselves. There, they would support each other in strategies that would meet the material conditions of their use and the needs of the impacted community. One such strategy turned the abstinence-only model on its head. Rather than taking an opiate away entirely, they would replace it with methadone. In theory, this strategy was a pioneering step towards medicalization on a national level. In the context of the border and in Albuquerque, it re-articulates the narco frontier to a side of possibilities that centers Quebrada as primary agents in reducing the harms of their drug use. Along with methadone, it provided forms of education to engage Chicanos in local histories in a long-standing struggle with colonialism. For example, the book to the left is a publication of photographs archived by community members in Albuquerque and throughout New Mexico. Early fragments were included in educational initiatives to teach Chicano history to those receiving methadone at the storefronts, as well as those living in the colony. History of oppression as an organizing principle transformed the framework of addiction in health to a model for self-determination, necessitating new tools that start and extend the clinic. The quote to the right is from a commentary members of Quebrada crafted for a national conference on heroin addiction in 1973. Quote, Chicanos slowly but inexplorably are intensifying their struggle to free themselves from the chains of internalized colonialism. It will be a long fight indeed, but as victory nears, the question will be, why did Chicanos stop using dope? This situated epistemology of substance use challenges mainstream notions of addiction that were merely focused on the body. However, what appears marginal on the most outer geographic reach of the US southern border, this knowledge made its way to a center. For example, during the Vietnam War, the military concentrated on rehabilitating US servicemen, and they feared would return dependent on heroin. Behind this intervention overseas lies a theory that it was easier to get a soldier off the habit of drugs in Vietnam than it was to rehabilitate them after they returned home as an addict. In devising an approach to bring soldiers back and leave their habits behind, the federal government established military drug treatment programs overseas. Knowledge from Quebrada's program became visible and valuable to the federal government. In this sense, members occupied more than a physical space on the ground and reclaimed an ecological space where knowledge circulated across seas. For example, Quebrada's director of training, Joe Gaioa, was one of the 6 men to be selected for a citizen task force led by the drug czar Jerome Jaffe, who lent insights and assistance over a 15-day tour in Vietnam to military drug specialists in training. Being the only one from the southern border, while the rest of the task force were from New York and Chicago, blurring the periphery and centers of knowledge production that post-colonial theorist Walter Mignolo calls the coloniality of knowledge. This core periphery collaboration centered in epistemology from the border, creating an outward orientation of the US-Mexico border that is otherwise marginal or misrepresented as merely a narco frontier. Informed by border encounters with drugs, the set of recommendations put forth by the task force resonates with the core objective from Quebrada, abolition. For example, there was no general policy on amnesty in the context of drug use among servicemen. The Army program allows an addict to turn himself in for treatment in exchange for immunity from prosecution, so long as he is not under investigation. Members of the Citizen Task Force emphasize, quoted by Jaffe, the principles of amnesty is a bona fide instrument in the treatment of drug-addicted servicemen. Here we see conditions of knowledge making across geopolitical scales from Albuquerque's borderlands, national US drug policy, and globally all the way to Vietnam. This flexibility of an alternative border infrastructure makes possible the circulation of knowledge and relationships across space. In the case of the border of this example, the recommendation insisted on the military approach to servicemen with sensitivity rather than punishment. This recommendation informed by lived experiences of people who have been incarcerated and continue that and the communities that have experienced that incarceration. Scholars have used the term abolition to describe this construction of life-affirming institutions, as we see here with Kabella, that takes into account the structural conditions that put people into prisons, detention camps, and other forms of incarceration. Rather than responding with punishment, these institutions address harms with repair and accountability. Worlds of repair are multiple, but transformation involves intentional efforts to delegitimate and dismantle carceral institutions. During the opening ceremony of Kabella, the colony director, Paul Garcia, says, before Kabella, we were tortured by law. If we did not secure the drug, we were punished by the disease. If we did secure it, we were punished by the police. There were two doors open to us, the door to jail and the door to the penitentiary. And so it was a prison that became the revolving door for many of us. Kabella's rehabilitation approach involved a world created and sustained through mutual aid on reclaimed treaty lands and demilitarized institutions constructed in a place where the border is refracted through it. It offers a different way of inhabiting a boundaried world of incarceration and freedom, violence, and healing. And in this way, the border infrastructure of Kabella offers us imaginaries of past and future as resources to otherwise approach our present moment, the so-called drug crisis at the border. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The great thing is we have ample time for questions or comments or thoughts that folks have. I know I have several of my own. I'm going to open it up to the room in case folks have things that are on the tip of their tongue.
Did you see any ties to religion in either the archival or, talking to people? I know my experiences with addiction and family members, that's, a central part in recovery.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Not in this particular case, at least that didn't come through in my interviews, but I also didn't frame any of my questions around that. This is a community that is Mexican American, and so many of the ways that they move about in the world is structured by religion, like Catholicism and things like that. So there was mentions towards maybe being in spaces of for example, in New Mexico, and I'm sure in many places in the world, different congregations celebrate a saint. So they had mentioned being in places around that, but not so much religion was part of their approach, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't. That just wasn't a question that I went through. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have a ton of questions.
Sure.
The first would be, the last slide was from 1971. What happened in the intervening 50 years?
Was it?
What happened in the intervening 50 years? Is it still there?
It's not. Yeah, that's kind of so this is part of the book. But yeah, so so what I was trying to argue in this chapter is, so Kabella was short-lived. They organized in from 1968 to 1972, but they were the first to bring methadone to which is a drug that's used in the treat heroin addiction. And it was the first time that methadone was used in a residential setting. Before that, they would ship people off to hospitals, either to Kentucky or to Texas, I believe, were the two hospital locations. So this was a time that legislation passed. Kabella is strategically working with the state to bring these resources. And they secure funding through the War on Poverty, so the Great Society, these kind of things. And so, but they did most of the organizing. What I found in the archive was really the grant that they wrote for the funding, as well as the institution, the National Health, National Institution for Mental Health. I can't remember what it was called back then. It wasn't the NIH, but it was predated the NIH. So once they started gaining some kind of a power, like gaining power, which through getting access to land, is when you started seeing it being like a contentious space, and it was eventually taken over by the state, and then it was eventually, right now you can trace its legacy to the University of New Mexico has a huge like their flagship institution focusing on substance use across like heroin, opioids, and alcohol. You can actually trace its roots back to Kabella. Yeah.
I can just jump in on that, the war on poverty of it all, because we've had conversation about it. I'm fascinated by the war on poverty for a variety of reasons. My familiarity with it is more like tangential through how Native American communities were able to access those funds in the 60s. But my general sense of the war on poverty was like a situation where this big, robust federal initiative, but they were kind of like building the plane as they were flying it. So like there wasn't, in the instances that I've seen, like people applying for things that were used for things that like the federal government couldn't probably conceive of. Was that the grant that they applied for? Was there a drug rehabilitation component to it, or was it more general?
No, you're absolutely right. Like a lot of the methadone clinics that were started during that time used war on poverty funding, and it was through model cities grants, which is interesting because that's like the highways, like model cities. So yeah, a lot of the funding. Yeah, and part of it, I think that was, methadone was introduced, and I was trying to like emphasize that it's not just a solution to help with withdrawal and like cravings and those things. It was really introduced to deal with crime, and it kind of went with the idea that people had to like rob and steal in order to like maintain their habit. So the intervention from like the top down level was to deal with crime, and that's where you see like Kabella kind of like playing with that language, like it'd serve the community against the war on poverty and the war on crime. But really, they like in my argument, I'm trying to show that like methadone was an emancipatory tool to like where they can exchange their drug sentences for treatment. And completely imperfect, and but it was a moment where they could kind of have an abolitionist like kind of politic.
Thank you very much for being the last speaker and having such an interesting talk at the very end. So thank you also for arranging this. In that short period of time where they were in operation, do you have a sense for who was mainly being served, or who make up the community that were largely addicted that they were served? I see a lot of pictures of men.
Yeah, right.
I presume Chicano men. Are there others that are also being treated?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, at that time it was mostly Chicano men. But there, what I did find in the archives, I don't have like the access to like all the clients that they served, but most of them were men, and there were they had couples. So it was like the radar site was like a base, like servicemen lived there on this, and it was like 37 units of housing and like multiple, so they were able to like bring their families. So there was some that they would treat as like a couple or a family, which I thought was really interesting too, to kind of, if we think about the drug war today, it's really about separating families and isolating things like that. But their approach was keeping them together, in space. Yeah.
I'd be curious to get if that's maybe going to be part of your book, if you get their kind of backstories to the kinds of men that ended up in these, that took advantage of these programs.
Yeah, that's been the hardest part, to be honest. One, like this is the late 1960s, so they're old. Right. So I found the people I interviewed weren't directly involved with the Kabella. They either organized like the Black Berets, they organized with them. But I do want to find, for the book is try to find, there has to be someone. Yeah. and also we're dealing with something with high mortality rates, right? Like drug addiction. So a lot of them like passed prematurely, whether that's through, overdose or contracting, hepatitis C, HIV, and even, violence. It really was a place under like state violence, so. But yeah, I really appreciate that. And that's what I was trying to go for, is having that. And what I did find is, what brought me to Kabella was actually finding, news clippings and news stories about these raids that were happening. And it was like cops going in, hundreds of them going in and they would do these like entrapment schemes where they would go to bars or something and have undercover cops and like, and like very low level, like $5 of like heroin or something. And then they would take their names and then they would go raid them and take them into this prison. So like, we think of mass incarceration, this is how it's happening. So it's that critical moment that Kabella like is like, hey, like stop, like let us kind of have some like authority over this and establish like our own institution that really meets the needs, in some ways. So
also very difficult to find, but do you have any idea? I mean, it was very short-lived. Do you have any idea on any kind of success rate? Like, was it used as a model to say this is working, or?
Yeah, I was trying to show, so I don't think I have it on this talk, but there were several, so because, they're like lay professionals, so they need to contract and involve like medical professionals. So it was like also a moment of like experiment, like it was experimental methadone. So there was experiments like kind of happening simultaneously, it was under Kabella's control, but of course like the methadone piece like involved like a medical scientific, which I do talk about like in another talk and I do talk about the knowledge produced around that, like, methadone in the Southwest, and kind of followed some of the scientists, like how like those studies informed like some of their theories around addiction. So I think like they're, I don't know about like success in that like, I think methadone was so new at the time that like, and the objective of methadone was like, does it reduce crime? Like it wasn't so much like, are people going to rehabilitate, so like, so you had to kind of put it in that context as well. But yeah, that was a great question. Yeah.
Do you mind if I just go back a little bit? You don't have to go back to the slides,
Sure,
but you talked about two models of causality for addiction, one of them being economic and one of them being behavioral.
Yeah.
I wanted to irrigate that a little bit, just because I think it's well established that there's a relationship between money and going to jail for your drugs, but that's different than establishing a link between addiction and economic inequality. Those two things, in other words, like I don't doubt that any economic inequality affects this aspect of it, because if you are wealthy, you afford a good defense attorney, first off, or your drug is legal. Right. So no question about that. But the causes of addiction are, I would say, how do you address that? Because I feel like that's a critical question that is sort of like a linchpin of what you're arguing, is that it's a economic thing, and I guess I don't know if that is like state of the scientific art that economics is. I don't doubt that it is. I come from Baltimore, right, which is a similar type circumstance, right? Like you go into the Baltimore City Jail, which I had a brother spend some time there, or the state penitentiary, God help you. Yes, and the majority of those are drug related, right? But then I also come from a family that is middle class and has a history of addiction, but none of us went to jail for it.
Right.
So like the question of addiction, I think, is distinct from necessarily going to prison for whatever you're doing. A casual heroin user, someone who uses it once a month for like just a party or whatever, might go to prison for it, but might not be an addict. And so, That person might go to prison,
Casual
right?
heroin.
What's
You know,
that?
how common is to see a casual heroin?
Well, that's I think that it's more common than you might think. Yeah, like I know quite a few people who
Just do it for fun every once in a
you snort it once in a while because it's a snortable drug. If you're not injecting it, snorting it's a safer way. You're not going to be sharing a needle with anybody. But you will go to prison for the same as an addict because you're going to be caught with a small amount, right? So I feel like those are distinct things. Like the causes of addiction are super complicated and probably have to do with neurochemistry plus a lot of social factors, economic factors, all these things. So that's just kind of my observation is that it seemed like a dichotomy between those two guys. And I'll bet that is a false dichotomy. I'll bet that there are both things going on in there.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I wasn't trying to make it a dichotomy. I think I was also like trying to play on like the border, like, you know, like thinking
Sure,
of
yeah.
border as,
Right.
like-
It lends itself to the metaphor.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was going for it, but that's really helpful for me to like think about that. And you know, I don't want to present that like there is a dichotomy because you're absolutely right. Like addiction is a very complex you know, thing to understand on many levels, you know. As far as like this scientific basis of like economics, there was a Princeton scholar that's really famous, like the deaths of despair, to like talk about overdose rates in like you know, middle class men in like, you know, places where you know, I'm trying to say the manufacturing districts in the Midwest and things like that, that they did find like kind of this economic, you know, that like the loss of work and, you know, kind of the social fabric kind of disintegrating around them, that did, you know, relate to, you know, people dying at higher rates. Because of that. So there's like, that's one study I'm thinking of, and that's been like pushed back, you know, like, it's funny because that hit, like I said, that's been the argument, you know, in the 60s of like economic, like basis for addiction rather than it being behavioral. But now we're seeing, you know, kind of this debate come up again in ways. But you're absolutely right that it is like, it's not just economic and it's not just behavioral and it's not just biological. There are many factors that we're still trying to understand.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my point is that there's a lot going on with what causes addiction rather than, I think the treatment of addiction is a little more clear cut. Just because money, there's a saying in the legal system, you get all the justice you can pay for.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have, and my mother was a public defender for 40 years.
Yeah.
And so she used to say, yeah, right. You know, like we have, like at the circuit court, people had 15 minutes per case to prepare for a trial, right? So, you know, that would drive that aspect of it. But the addiction thing, I think, is a whole like distinct issue that probably needs to be like, why would Chicano men be addicted to heroin? Right? I think that's like a really interesting question. Or were they more addicted than other groups, but they just were incarcerated more often. So it seemed to me to be distinct you know, issues. And I don't doubt that in the second case, you know, you might well have plenty of addiction in middle class, but those people just go to jail. And so
Yeah, absolutely.
anyway, just an observation.
What's going on with this radar site now? I don't know this. What is it now? Their land, they were like, they just took it back and they're doing it.
Right, I know. Unfortunately, I was like trying like the reclaiming was just a use of it for like a year, and then it went back to you know, I think once the state took it over, I think they moved the program to another building that was more integrated into like the hospital system, like in this, because this was kind of like, I think it was like 17 miles outside of the city, so it was kind of rural.
Right.
And yeah, it kind of, I think it went back to being abandoned, and I think there are other organizations trying to make use of it, which I think, you know, I don't have enough time to talk about the land grant history, but like I know that like land grant heirs have tried to also get it back. But what's the last I've seen, which is really interesting, and I want to think about this as I write the book too, is that you know, not the property, I think the housing has been sold off for private property, but right near it is like storage, it's like used for storage for like Facebook or something like. So talk about like
So they have servers.
extracting, yeah, like servers, talk about extracting the land again.
It's actually perfect.
Yeah, I know, isn't it? It's like
I find that like,
dystopian. I didn't want to leave you with a dystopian.
yes, right, it's totally dystopian.
Yeah, I know, unfortunately. But yeah, so I hope to like kind of think about that more. And I think it'll require the land part really came a little bit later in my dissertation. So this is kind of a newer, I think there are many other sources that I can look at, including, like the actual radar site itself. So yeah.
Cool.
Well, a couple of like maybe comments or points first, just because, I mean, I think you've already emphasized them, but I do think they are worth emphasizing again. It's like, one is that the way you narrate the relationship between the war on poverty and the war on drugs, which like, popular discourse, these are sort of perceived as being separate things, like the war on drugs is this more conservative project, whereas like the war on poverty is the remnants of social welfare, New Deal reforms, and never the twain shall meet. But like you show here how they were, at least at this moment, like very linked to each other through this, which I think is fascinating. And the other thing is the kind of the references early on in the piece to kind of how this sort of ties into post-colonial narratives or trajectories, which there are, without getting into these, like there are other studies of drugs and addiction in the New Mexico area, which also kind of make those claims of like, this is tied to colonial history, and there is never any attempt to explain that. But like, this is so palpable in the sense that it's carved out of the Spanish land grant system. Many generations removed from that.
Yeah.
But that is like, seems to me like, at least in a very like fruitful empirical note to actually make that claim, which I feel like your project has and maybe others don't necessarily have. But then the question sort of separate from that, and I guess because it was such a short-lived experiment, is like, one would be like, is there any cultural memory within like the greater New Mexico area of this project? I'm presumably not, because you're like extracting it from the archives.
Yeah.
But like, and then if there isn't, like, I don't know, it just seems so weird, especially in my brief time in Albuquerque, like riding the bus in the morning with like people on their way to like one of two methadone clinics. Like, it's so limited, and yet it was in a previous generation this site of like pretty significant experimentation that impacted like the military and all this stuff. So is there any of that like inklings, or is it basically confined to the archives?
Yeah. I mean, that was, part of my objective of this chapter was to like make visible like this this history, right? Because it like I'm from New Mexico, as you know, and I've been studying drugs, and I didn't come across this until like the very end of my dissertation. So it was a study that kind of got tacked on. So I was really surprised to be like, how have I never heard of this? And so, yeah, I think there is like, once I started asking around, having the name Kabella and like the Chicano, I think the Chicano movement was my entry point. And I kept, I do a great job, but I kept trying to hold, Kabella with the Chicano, like it was in step with the Chicano movement. It just kind of had its like own like priorities, which was this obviously like, trying to get the state to create something that wasn't there, and so I feel like when I interviewed like activists that were involved in the Chicano movement, or that were part of that were in the area. Like Atrisco is huge. It's like many miles. But they like are like kind of separated by like neighborhoods. So like Armijo, which I talked about at the beginning, which one of the founders is from. So once I got like kind of in like the like very microscopic of like Armijo, like in like the, when I talk about the schoolhouse, like that was a memory that came up for a lot of people. Like, oh, the schoolhouse was where we did a lot of like these meetings, and like, it wasn't just, drug use. It was like also like meetings to try to get, water lines to the South Valley from the city, so it was like this like space that people would need to try to make their conditions, better in some way. So I guess in that way, but yeah, most of my stuff like comes from like the archive or like news clippings, and like some interviews. But yeah, I hope to like kind of it was really trying to make this, project visible, in some way. That I do, the argument of my book is that it's a future, like you know, I try to connect like, you know, Kabella to the addiction center, the research center I was telling you about.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, called CASA, I just don't remember what the acronyms mean right now. Center of Alcohol, something. But yeah, that like I try to argue that this, you know, is kind of the foundation for recovery. And because of its like radical, you know, it's not like radical in a sense that you know, it was like militant, but like, you know, it was a different way to approach drugs at that time. Kind of set the path for like other like more revolutionary or like radical approaches to like substance use. For example, New Mexico was the first state to sanction and legalize take-home naloxone, which is a drug used to reverse overdose. Narcan, yeah, there you go. So it was like the first state to do that. So I try to argue that because of this like history, this long struggle, like going back to the 60s, like these things were able to happen. Like it already had a base to build from, you know.
This was the era, so Barb is old enough to remember, and you may be too, but I was in Northern California for a lot of the early 70s.
Yeah.
And this just, you saw this all the time.
This is my job and my children.
Not that you're as old as I am. I don't know. I'm assuming, but Barb is probably old enough to remember that in Northern California, at least where I was, a little kid running around barefoot in Northern California in the like early 70s, this was all over the place. You would see these experimental centers like all over the place. And I would say maybe one still exists. Like they all disappeared without a ripple.
Yeah, for sure.
Because like there would be funding, they would get funding from the feds were loose with the funding under Reagan, that all disappeared. And so there would be all these experimental things. If they were somewhat successful, they might persist until into the 70s. And then under Reagan was like big gone. So I mean, not surprised it didn't last till now. I guess I would have expected it to last past 72. That was a pretty short lived.
It's still like it lasted, but the Kibrad, the organization, like the activists weren't like the lead, they didn't lead it anymore. It got transferred over.
You will discover that often activists are poor organizers.
Yeah.
This is the discovery of all these like little things, is that people have great ideas and are really like stick it to the man or whatever. Like, okay, here's a spreadsheet of all this stuff and here's your budget, organize it. And they're like, shit. Like those personalities don't overlap always. So
it seemed to like put it pretty like they've like, you know, acquired a
it happened. It absolutely happened. Right.
Pretty good, you know.
Advantage of grants that.
But like I don't think that it was just
by at that point, I mean, the war on poverty is kind of winding down.
Yeah, there was no
Funding,
money. They
so,
couldn't, you know. So of course, like a highly resourced institution like UNM.
So we can't blame Reagan, maybe Nixon.
Yeah.
Well, Nixon also, but I was also gonna say that like proximity to doctors probably did matter, because if you have overdoses, all you need is a few overdose deaths, and then people are like, maybe being in the middle of nowhere is not a good idea.
They're not in this story, and I was intentional about that because I wanted it to be from a bottom. You know, we have stories of the white doctor coming in and like, you know, so I wanted to be intentional about where organizing and where the impetus for the center came from. And I think that came from like material, real conditions, you know. You know, so the doctor story is there. It's just not the one I want to write. But if someone wants to write it.
Is it in the interest of the state if they're not approaching it from the criminalization aspect or the medical aspect, right? To allow these communities to kind of try to work on themselves.
Say that again, sorry.
Well, it's not as a comment, it's not a question. I'm just saying, how much is it really in the interest of the state to have these kinds of facilities? If they're not approaching it from this kind of criminalization aspect where you're putting in the prisons. Now we have private prisons to benefit from that, or from a medical aspect where you're putting them in institutions, right?
Yeah.
I think Tennessee is doing a lot of work putting Narcan in the hands of
Who is?
Tennessee.
Uh-huh.
On the hands of community organizers and non-activists, and using that approach instead of pushing a lot of money into criminalization. That it's a little bit weird for Tennessee.
Yeah,
right.
So haven't they legalized it over the counter in some places?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Narcan is now over the counter, but Yeah, you can get it like at a grocery store.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
I think you can get
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. But that's very recent. That was like within
Right.
a few years or something, so.
Well, how much is that because younger kids are dying from fentanyl? Like,
sure, that's
because
why
of
it
the
is.
people that are affected now
Are not those people.
are not those.
Yeah,
people.
right, right.
Precisely, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other?
So when does the book come out?
Yeah, the most important. Another year on that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's still in the works, but yeah.
Well, just keep saying that, you'll get tenure, you'll get.
Okay.
You'll write it for the next.
Yeah, right, exactly.
12 years.
No other questions? We'll do another round of applause. Here today, especially study week, much appreciated.